Hello and welcome to Brokenomics. Now, as you know, I'm a diligent peruser of the comments under Brokenomics, and one of the themes that has been coming up a number of times is people have asked me to explain some of the basic terms that I use, because, of course, actually it might not be clear to everybody some of the more basic terms. So, I am your humble artisan, and if my patrons demand it, then of course I shall provide. So in this episode, I'm going to go through 100 fairly basic terms, explain what they are, how they work, and I will elaborate to the appropriate minimum, but obviously I'm me, so I can't help myself from elaborating on one or two of them and explaining a little bit more. So, without further ado, let's dive into 100 fairly basic terms and with appropriate elaboration, of course. Right, okay. So first on my list is I've got fiat money. What is fiat money? So this contrasts with the second term, which is commodity money. So for a long time, when people were given the choice of producing a money or using something for money, many things were tried, but ultimately it just went down to gold and silver and bronze because they were portable, they were compact, and they were sufficiently rare. And then you got that separation in the value bands between, say, copper, silver, and gold. Fiat money is money that has its value not because it is rare, it is actually infinite, but because the government decrees that is money. So fiat being, by decree, that is what fiat money is. So it is basically just paper money, and there it is. Commodity money, we've explained, that's what people would go to if it was not paper money. Now, paper money is prevalent in our modern age, of course. In the past, paper money has been tried a couple of times, and it's never lasted to the 50-year mark. In our current iteration, paper money is about at the 50-year mark, so we will see if it will persist. The previous time it worked was one of the sons of Genghis Khan. Was it Kubra Khan? I think it was. He instituted a system of paper money where basically, if you turned up in the empire, he would take your gold and he would keep that, and then he would give you a piece of paper instead. So work out for yourselves why he liked that system. Next term, legal tender. So this is basically linked to fiat money. How do governments, once they've got their pieces of paper circulating, how do they make it? How do they make you accept them? Well, they make them legal tender so that you have to accept them, and also they say things like you can only pay taxes in this money, and that sort of gives it value, because of course you need it for that and you need it for exchange, so it ends up becoming the dominant form of money. A couple more in the money section before we move on. Monetary base. So this is basically cash and coins that is held by central banks and by other banks. So basically literally the money itself. This one does confuse people. I remember putting out I didn't put it out, but one of our chaps, he clipped a section from my BlackRock video many moons ago about how BlackRock has more money than the total amount of cash in the world. Anyway, put that out as a TikTok. It did very well. About 4 million people watched it. And most of the comments were people saying, this guy is an idiot. How can BlackRock possibly have more money than all the cash in the world? That's impossible. Well, no, because the amount of cash and coins is a tiny fraction of the total amount of money that circulates. Most of it is, it's electronic. It's done for your debit card. It's done for your bank records. So the monetary base is where you start the money at, which with the paper and the metal coins, but it's only a really tiny fraction of the total amount of what we call money, such as when you use your card or your bank account or payment transfer. If you look at the total amount of money, it's significantly higher. And the next couple of terms are going to be looking at some of the delineations, and I'm only going to start with the first two. There's many of these, but M1 is a term which is basically the monetary base plus things that are in an account, like your current account, or the version of current accounts that banks have, the central bank, and so on. So that's M1. That is not often used. However, I do often use M2, which is another measure of money. So it is basically M1 plus short-term deposits. So if you make a deposit overnight with a central bank or with another bank, or even slightly longer than that, so these are things that are either money or very, very close to being basically something that you can move around very quickly. All of these is highly liquid money that can go from one place to another. And it's the M2 measure that I tend to focus on because you can see the growth in that as more money is printed, although as we will come back to shortly, printing money isn't exactly how it works. But yes, think of M2 as the monetary base. M1, so basically it's cash, coins, and liquid reserves, so which are not physically money, but are numbers in a bank account which are not tied up for anything other than basically immediate withdrawal. So I track the total money supply, which I basically mean M2, and by following that, I can see the level of debasement of assets, which is another term I'll come back to. In fact, no, let's explain it now. So the total amount of stuff in the world, and you divide that by the total amount of money in the world, you get the price. Because obviously, all the stuff in the world has a price, and all the money in the world has buying power. So if you divide one by the other, you basically get the price of everything. And if you increase the amount of money, and the best proxy I use is M2, very liquid money, you can track the rate of which money is being debased. So if suddenly the amount of money were to double and grow, obviously the price of all the stuff would have to get redenominated by double to take into account the fact that the money supply has grown. So there you go. That's also debasement. So yes, M2 is a common term I very often use in Brokenomics. So yes, it's good to explain it. Next term I got is liquidity. So money that you can spend quickly, probably the easiest way to describe that. So let's think about liquidity. If you are you could be rich, and a good example might be an English lord who has inherited a castle. He might technically be rich because he lives in a castle with lots of land, but he might have next to no liquidity. And this is an actual thing that happens a lot with these sort of English lords, is they are technically rich in that they have an awful lot of assets, being the castle and the family land that they've inherited, but they have no liquidity. So functionally, they're actually quite poor and they can't afford to get the roof fixed, because the roof fixer is not going to come along and you can't pay him in a quarter of an acre of land that you've got out back. What he wants is cash. But the lord, he doesn't have cash, because even though he's rich, it's all tied up in land and castle, and he has very little actual money. So he's illiquid. And liquidity is a crucial term because no matter how rich you are, if you don't have it, you can't do things, and it's very easy to get yourself into a bit of a pickle. So when I talk about governments have a liquidity problem, I'm basically saying that they might need to refinance their debts, pay their welfare bills, buy a new submarine, whatever it is that they've got on their mind. But they could very easily have a liquidity crisis where, even though they've got assets, even though they've got the ability to generate more, well, at least they've got the ability to generate money by printing it, they might not have any liquidity. Why does liquidity matter? Well, and I measure liquidity through M2, which is why I wanted to explain that first. When I talk about the cycles, I talk about periods where liquidity is increasing. And that basically means that governments and businesses are having to increase the short-term money on hand. And you can do that by selling assets, but more likely the liquidity upswing is going to come from governments by the next term that we're going to talk about, quantitative easing. The finding these short-term deposits. If you're a government, you print them. If you're a business, or actually you might also borrow them as well. And if you're a business, you're going to borrow them. And also if you're an individual, again, of course, you can take out loans and other things to increase your personal liquidity at the expense of later debt. And as I will come back to later, I'm sure with one of these terms, I'll talk about the cycle. There are times when liquidity is increasing, when governments are spending more, they're taking out more debt, They're printing more money effectively. Businesses and individuals are taking on more debt or whatever it is they're doing, but the increase of liquidity is going up. There's more money sloshing around, looking for somewhere to go. And actually, my whole investment philosophy is based on keep track of that liquidity and figure out which assets respond the best to an increase in liquidity, money sloshing around in the system. And bear in mind that liquidity is cyclical and it tends to operate over roughly a 4 or 5 year timescale. If I can see that liquidity increases for a couple of years and then decreases for a couple of years, well, I want to be buying assets at the beginning when liquidity is low, and I want to buy assets that respond very well to an increase in liquidity, which, as I've talked about, tends to be basically Bitcoin and high-performing tech stocks. And I want to ride that as a liquidity cycle increases, and then I want to take profits when the liquidity cycle peaks, and that's what we talk about an awful lot on Brokenomics. And then I want to have a higher cash position when liquidity is decreasing, because if liquidity is decreasing, any liquidity that you have, any money that you have, is now becoming more valuable against any given asset, especially things that respond well to liquidity, because, of course, when liquidity is decreasing, things like tech stocks and crypto and basically all of them, but to a greater or lesser degree, your money goes further. So you can buy more of these and then you can ride the cycle again. Now, that dynamic for playing the markets will maybe change one day, but that at the moment is the predominant, and certainly for me, the easiest way to make money. And so that's what I focus on, that liquidity cycle. But liquidity itself is essentially money on hand that you have at a moment's notice. Okay, next term I've got is quantitative easing. What is that? The very simple way of explaining it is to say that it's money printing, but it's not technically that. Technically, there is no money printing. There is simply an increase in liquidity. And that increase in liquidity is achieved through quantitative easing. And that is done by the central bank taking a stock of its country's own debt that it had previously bought, for whatever reason, and selling that out into the market so that it gets the cash instead. So it increases the liquidity that's available by taking bonds that are other locked away on the central bank balance sheet and pushing them out into the market. No, sorry, that's, yeah. Well, you know what I mean. You know what I mean. It's increasing the total amount of liquidity available, which functionally is the same thing as printing money. So even though it is technically wrong to say that the government are printing money, because, well, sometimes they do that, but mostly they're actually doing this quantitative easing process. And the reason that they do that is because then, at a later date, they can do something called quantitative tightening, which is basically the opposite. They go back and they reverse the process. And what that does for them is it allows them to pretend that they were never in the process of simply printing money into existence in the first place, and therefore this is not a banana republic. That's essentially what they're getting at. So there we go, that one covered as well. Right, let's do some terms from macroeconomics, because of course these always get mentioned as well. Let's start with GDP. GDP is a term that you will often hear on the news, in articles, and so on. GDP is rising, isn't that good? We want GDP to go up and all that stuff. But what is it? Essentially, it is a sum of spending. So there are various components to GDP, such as consumer spending, revenues of businesses, and government expenditure. You add up all of these components and you get a total measure of spending. And that has come to be considered the main indication of health of an economy and how we compare each other. I have issues with this because it is very, very basic to define somebody's wealth by the amount of money they spend. Now, if you are comparing yourself to your neighbour or family member or whatever, you probably wouldn't do it like that. You would probably judge somebody's wealth by the stock of assets that they have or the skills that they have or whatever it is. That would be something like how you measure it. What you would not do is measure it purely on the amount of money spent, because some people basically just spend an awful lot of money when they don't need to, and they support that through debt, or in the government's case, they support it through immigration. Now, if your household was basically taking in random Syrians every other week and running up your credit card, your household could presumably output an awful lot of spending. But I wouldn't consider that to be a healthy metric by which to judge you. So I don't like the fact that we tend to judge countries by GDP. The other thing I don't like about it is it also assumes that all government spending is equal. So put it this way. Let's say the government were to borrow a load of money and use that to build a bridge that went halfway out the Atlantic Ocean. So it's a bridge to nowhere, effectively. Yeah, it serves no purpose whatsoever. However, what they would have done is spent an awful lot of money doing that, and that would be recorded as an increase in GDP, simply because it's an increase of spending. And if they then decided, oh, actually, that was a stupid idea, we're going to get rid of this bridge. If they then demolished it, the money they spent demolishing it would then also be recorded as an increase in GDP. So this is the thing, it assumes that all spending is good and not wasted, which is, of course, complete nonsense. And it's this kind of thinking that, the most poignant example of this I found was it was assumed that, say, Russia would be defeated very quickly in the Ukraine war because the US was supplying Ukraine with more money, and it was assumed that all the money was spent equally. But what was discovered fairly quickly is that it cost the Russians 50 times less to produce an artillery shell than a US-made one, because of corruptions in the system, lobbyists, regulations, taxations, all of those kind of things. So if your economy is 50 times more efficient, and I'm not saying the Russian economy is 50 times more efficient at everything, but in this particular case they were, it makes no account for that. Also, it makes no account for the fact that if your GDP was got there by just importing immigrants or running up debt or stupid infrastructure, the bridge to nowhere or the NHS, whatever it is, it makes no allocation of how wisely that money was spent or on what, or whether the skills or security or happiness of the people goes up. So I don't like using GDP. And when I look at countries, what I tend to look at is things like their output. So a good proxy is energy output. Not to say that all energy output is being wisely spent, but it tends to be more wisely spent than when government is controlling about 40% of your GDP and government spends money very unwisely. Or look at agricultural output or steel output, or basically look at anything functional or real, as opposed to a simple measure of spending. So yes, that is GDP. Another way of looking at GDP, actually, and this is valuable, is you could look at GDP, and I'm going to have to bring in some terms that I haven't explained that I've got later in this document. GDP is increase in population, effectively, plus increase in debt, plus productivity. I want to come back to all of those, but essentially it's measuring the debt, the population growth, and the innovation. And really only one of those is good. Only really the productivity increase, getting better at doing things, is real and measurable. Increase in debt is not good. Increase in population, well, it could be good if it was native-born citizens who are inculcated in that society from birth, who understood its norms and customs. Less good if it's a third worlder sort of immediately shipped in. The debt is obviously bad, and productivity is being strangled by the fact that taxes and regulations are so high. But nevertheless, GDP can be useful as a reductive and simplified measure when we're comparing it to something else. And the something else is a term that we have already explained, so the debt. The total debt in the UK is about the same size as the GDP. So at that point, it becomes very simple to look at which of the two is growing for highest, because if they're both at 100%, if they're both the same level, then at that point you can simply look at which one of those is growing faster. And in the UK, certainly, and in fact most Western countries, in fact almost all of the Western countries now I think about it, the debt is growing faster. And you can measure that simply by the amount you have to pay servicing the debt. That's about 4 or 5%. Whereas GDP growth, especially in the UK, is utterly negligible. It's a little bit better in America, not much better in most of the other Western countries. And actually, the growth that we do have is being fueled by debt and immigration. Very little by productivity increase, if any, if that isn't even negative. So I suppose it has one or two functions, but otherwise, GDP, commonly discussed term, you commonly see it in the news. It's just a function of spending, and it makes no allocation as to how wisely that money is spent. Don't like it, but it is a key term that you'll see on the news all the time. Inflation, again, another term you're going to see on the news all the time. This is a good one. Inflation. Here's a challenge for you. If you can find an old dictionary, a dictionary written before about 1990, maybe 1985, something like that. If you go and find an old dictionary and you look up the definition of inflation, and it will tell you that inflation is an increase in the money supply. So we talked about debasement above, about how the total amount of money, M2 or liquidity, is basically expanding. The increase in the money supply itself, that's what I think of as inflation. However, it has become twisted in recent terms in that when you increase the money supply, as we talked about, it causes the price level of everything to increase, so prices increase. And it has become warped lately that the cause has been superseded by the effect. So in a modern dictionary, they will tell you that inflation is prices going up. That's not true. Inflation is really the total amount of money going up that makes it look like prices are going up. And that is an important distinction because it's otherwise you're putting the cart before the horse. Because of the desire to make it look like it's not government causing the inflation by increasing the money supply, and they want to make it look like inflation is a function of, I don't know, greedy shopkeepers putting up their prices for no reason at all, or greedy workers trying to get more pay. They turn it around that other way, and that's why we've started using the term debasement to mean what inflation used to mean until relatively recently. But yeah, if we were having this conversation a few decades ago, we wouldn't need the word debasement because we would just use the word inflation instead. So that has become twisted. But essentially, what it means now is prices going up. Don't like that term either. Deflation. That is when prices fall. Not something you see often. That is actually the natural state of the world. That is how it should be. If we didn't have fiat money, the first term that we explained, if we were using a money that had a relatively fixed supply, like gold or silver or Bitcoin, then due to productivity, people finding out better, faster, smarter ways to work, the price of everything would fall every year. Because of course there's more stuff all the time. That stuff bubble is growing, and the money bubble is kind of fixed. I mean, actually, even with gold or something, they can mine about 2% a year, but still, that's pretty much close to fixed. So the normal condition for the world would be a slight price increase every year, as long as that productivity rate was higher than the rate that you can mine gold. So if gold is being mined at 2% a year, if productivity is 3% a year, you should see a 1% deflation every year, prices getting smaller. And actually, you do get a little bit of deflation, because things like, I don't know, computers, smartphones, stuff like that, I mean, a handful of things are being innovated, and they have such a high productivity rate that the price of these things actually falls. But remember, in a normal world, everything would fall. So you need to have a prodigious rate of productivity improvement for a price to actually fall in a world where money is being debased at around 11 to 14% a year. Okay. Monetary policy, again, another term you're going to hear in the news a lot, alongside fiscal policy. What is the difference? Monetary policy is basically led these days by central banks, and it's setting of interest rates, influencing the money supply. We've already talked about deciding whether we're going to do quantitative tightening, quantitative easing, what the interest rate is going to be, whether we're going to offer swap lines to. We won't go into that now, but so monetary policy is basically deciding how money is priced effectively. And for the last 2, maybe coming on 3 decades, monetary policy has been dominant. That is the key decision you make about the price of money. Before that, it was the other one. It was fiscal policy. What does fiscal policy mean? That is the setting of taxation and spending, and how the money is spent, what gets taxed, that's all fiscal policy. It looks like we are possibly, certainly the US with the return to Trump, returning to a period of fiscal dominance and not monetary dominance. Why is that significant? Because the US is running a deficit of about 2 trillion a year. And for the last couple of decades, we've been using monetary policy to make that an easy burden to bear by basically making money cheaper every year, easier to borrow, less attractive to save, so you're more incentivized to spend and so on. We've basically run these large deficits and forgotten about them, and then just let monetary policy make it a less bitter pill to swallow, or easier to swallow. There is a recognition with Doge and the incoming Trump administration, and hopefully other places in the Western world soon, that you need to return to a sensible set of fiscal policies where you don't tax as much, and the money that you do spend, you spend sensibly, which is going to mean, hopefully, less dramatic monetary swings. So it might mean an end to my investment thesis that I talked about, which is very cyclical based, very based on a monetary dominant environment. It might lessen the impact of that and mean the focus becomes all about appropriate tax and spend and whether that's efficient, which could mean that the investment strategy that I'm currently using needs to be thrown away, or at least modified, or I find a new one, or whatever it is, which I'm all up for, because it'll be a bit of work for me, but we're going to drive ourselves off a cliff if we don't do it, and I don't want to see that. So I welcome the return of fiscal dominance and fiscal policy. Next term that I've got is recession. So there is a technical definition of this. Recession is when there are 2 consecutive quarters of falling GDP. As we've already talked about, I don't like GDP, but whatever. We're stacking bad on top of bad here. So that's the technical definition. I've got a much easier definition, which is when you get poorer. Well, not you individually, but the collective you, all of you. When we're all getting poorer, that's a recession. And when we're not, it's growth. But why do I not like the technical thing? Well, because it's easy to manipulate GDP through extra taxation or immigration. It's easy to manipulate the benchmarks that you might be comparing it against inflation by just changing the definition of inflation, changing the way that it's measured. It's very easy to rig the set of numbers coming out of the government so that it doesn't look like we're actually in a recession. But to my mind, we have been in recession since at least the end of the COVID hubris, when money was being splashed around. And actually, probably we've been in recession since 2008, the great financial crisis. But if I were to say that in a mainstream environment, they would say, no, it doesn't meet the technical definition, there you're not. But remember, my definition is a lot simpler. It's just when we're all getting poorer. And almost inevitably, that has been the case since at least COVID, if not 2008, like I say. So yes, it is the economy contracting, but they rig the measurements a lot. Depression, what does that mean? So a depression doesn't have a technical definition. It is used by the mainstream to basically mean a severe recession, or an ongoing recession, or a prolonged or chronic recession. But actually what's really going on there with that is that these terms get changed over time when they start to make government look bad. So originally they didn't talk about recessions at all. They just said depressions to me when people were getting poorer, a bit like my definition, which I won't give up. And then people started to dislike the term depression because it made them realise that their political leaders were making bad decisions. So then they would swap it around to things like slump or recession. It basically means the same underlying thing. People are getting poorer, but it's just whatever is in vogue at the time. And depression was in vogue kind of pre-1950s. And governments came to hate the term so much they decided, well, let's just call it recession instead. And there's kind of a movement now to say, okay, well, recession's making us look bad, so let's call it a contraction instead. But effectively, it is just a a politician's shifting of terms in order to avoid the appearance of blame. Right, economic cycle. Right, that was something that I started to touch on before. Again, a core concept in Brokenomics, so it is worth explaining properly. It's linked to the liquidity that we talked about. So think about this. Quick model of the entire economy, and it's very simple. We have transactions in markets, and a market could be anything as simple as the hot dog market. So there's a buyer and a seller, there's a transaction, here's the money, I want a hot dog. And if you add up all of the transactions of people buying hot dog, that's the hot dog market. You add up all the transactions in the oil market, that's the oil market, and so on. So you've got all of these different markets. And how are they paying? How are they making these transactions? Well, they're either using money or they're using credit. Now, as we've already talked about, actual money, as in cash, notes and coins, is a very small percentage of the overall what we call money. The money base is a tiny, tiny fraction of total money. And what I didn't get into at that bit was the deeper level is that on top of money, there's also credit, borrowing. And here's the thing, credit spends just like money. So if I buy a hot dog from you, you're not particularly concerned. Let's assume your hot dog seller is one of those machines that goes beep when I present you my card. You're not particularly concerned whether I'm spending money from my current account or my overdraft, or if the money in my account is from a loan. From your point of view, you've received money, but almost certainly every time you do a transaction and you earn money from people, you've almost certainly accepted credit from somebody else. So how does this relate to economic cycles? Because credit is essentially borrowing. In fact, essentially it's borrowing from yourself in the future. So you can spend more money today at the cost of spending less money in the future. A nice easy example for you would be, maybe you're in your late 20s, early 30s and you buy a house. And so the year you turn 31 or whatever, you spend £300,000 that year, and what you actually did is you borrowed from yourself from the future in order to buy a house, and then for the next 25 years you spend less than you otherwise would because you're paying back your past self when you were 31 and you bought that house. So borrowing is basically pulling money into the present from the future. And that's a simple example with the house. But more broadly than that, individuals and businesses and even governments, when times are good and it looks like the economy is doing really well and everything's really clever and good times have come, people are inclined to take on more debt. So they pull in more spending from the future into the now. So you imagine, my line that I gave you, it goes up and then it goes down. Well, let's break that down on a granular level. So year 1, you borrow a little bit of money. Year 2, you borrow a little bit more. Year 3, you borrow a little bit more. Year 4, you borrow a little bit more. And so you create that cycle. And then eventually you will, hang on, I have to pay this back. So I borrow less. And then I'm down here, I'm repaying. So you can imagine that arc that goes like that. That essentially is the cycle. It's a phenomena based on borrowing and spending, pulling from the future, and for every dollar or pound that I spend today at the expense of the future means I need to pay it back, which in itself creates a cycle, and that's the economic cycle. And again, a big part of what I talk about on Brokenomics. I did an episode early on, I can't remember which one, but one of the relatively early episodes, I break that down in a lot more detail. But yes, core concept in Brokenomics is the cycle. Trade balance is the next one. Again, a term you hear on the news a lot, worth going into this one. So what is a trade balance? It is basically, let's say there is only 2 nations in the world, Westeros and Easteros or something. If one of them is exporting more and the other one is importing more, then let's say Easteros is a net exporter and Westeros is a net importer, then you could say that Westeros has a negative trade balance and Easteros has a positive trade balance. Essentially, one is exporting more. Right, why is that important? Because if you've got a surplus, then people are having to pay you for that. And how are they paying you for that? Well, they're going to have to be reducing their wealth to increase yours. In our Easteros and Westeros example, Westeros is going to have to be shipping gold over to Easteros because actual assets are coming in, cloth or weapons or, whatever it is that, they ship in. But gold is going out the other way. So Eastros is getting richer as an example. That's a simple example of two nations, but you can scale it up to 196 or whatever, how many countries that we have. There is this complex interplay, but you can boil it down to, are you exporting more than you import? And the way you should look at that in a slightly more reductive model is, if you are exporting more, you're getting richer. There is a big exception to this, and that is the United States. The United States is an exception to this because it runs these huge deficits, and it has for a long time, where it imports a lot more than it exports. And you might think, okay, well, it's getting poorer as a result of that. Well, actually, it isn't, because what it's doing is, because it's got the dollar and it has managed to enforce the dollar as a global currency that even other nations use when they are trading between themselves. The dollar has what has come to be termed this exorbitant privilege, which it can run these deficits and it can pay for it with printed money, with debt. And that basically never comes due, because there is always growth in the world somewhere. So there is always further demand for dollars, and therefore it can always get away with increasing the total amount of debt that it pumps out there, and therefore it is able to run a permanent deficit at no cost to itself, which is indeed an exorbitant privilege indeed. So yes, very, very, very clever for them. The only problem they've got is what happens if a alternative to the dollar comes along and people start adopting it, whether that be the BRICS currency or Bitcoin or gold or whatever it is. At that moment, the US would be in a bit of a pickle, because there are trillions of dollars out there that would then just come rushing home, because they've got nowhere to be, and it would find itself with the dollar tanking and foreigners being able to come in and buy up assets, and it would look to the foreigners like these assets were incredibly cheap, and that would obviously be very bad for the US. I suspect they would respond in some other way if it came to that, but yes, trade balance often comes up, is important. Just bear in mind the US is an exception.
If you would like to see the full version of this premium video, please head over to lotuseaters.com and subscribe to gain full access to all of our premium content.